you all on this blustery November evening. In fact, we're here to celebrate, as I'll explain in a moment, the publication of A Swallow in Winter, and it feels that that winter is already here. So joining me this evening, we have Sarah Ardizzone, and we have Timothee de Fombelle. So Timothée, as you know, is a French author and playwright. And in the UK, we've become very familiar and have loved his work, particularly the Toby Alone stories, Van Gogh, The Book of Pearl, Saving Celeste, and now, of course, this wonderful story, A Swallow in Winter. Sarah Ardizzone is a highly regarded translator from French into English and is twice winner, or has twice been awarded, the Marsh Award for children's books in translation. It's a huge, huge pleasure to have them both with us this evening. So bienvenue and welcome.
Thank you, Nikki. It's lovely.
I don't even know if that's right in that context. Is it, Sarah?
I think it's sounding excellent.
Okay, so to everybody who's joining with us, there will be an opportunity for questions later, and we'd just like you to pose your questions in the chat and we will take them from there rather than using the hands up facility. So first of all, can we talk to both of you because you have a very long-standing professional relationship. I've just been listening to the ease with which you've both been talking, and I've been very much the outsider enjoying listening to that conversation. What's it like when you've worked with somebody for almost 20 years?
Timothée, are you going to start us off here?
Yes, Sarah was my translator before I published the book, because we met, I think, a few months before my first book in French, Toby Alone, Toby Lolness. Yes, this one. So it's like a long, long story. And yes, you are my voice, Sarah, in English. So it's something I can't imagine writing without knowing that Sarah will come one day and take it.
That's so interesting. And being a voice means more than just reproducing your words.
Yes. You can hear that I'm not good in languages. And so it's magic for me to speak to people all over the world. It's really magic because my country is my language, is really my language. And I live in this language every day, from the morning to the night. So it's something I never imagined, that one day my stories would travel. And so yes, she's really my voice, because I'm mute if I'm not mute in French. In France, je peux parler à 66 millions de Français.
In French, I can talk to 68 million French people, but it's something else in another language. But you can hear what a magician Timothée is in language, regardless of what language he's speaking in. And it's such a joy growing, I suppose, with somebody and translating them at different life moments. And these fables are a different challenge again, but with great books, great big long books like Toby books and the Van Gogh books. It was like an addiction for me, disappearing into the vertigo of that pace and the drama and the cliffhangers. And my son just adores the cliffhangers at the end of each chapter and, you know, convinces me I've got to stay up late and keep on reading them to him. So I think we were both remembering the first day that we encountered each other, and Jane Winterbottom and I, the publishing director, had travelled out back in the days when these things were easier, from London to Paris to meet with Gallimard and to meet with Timothée. And it was a really big deal and a really special encounter, and that Gallimard had very much chosen Walker Books and not Disney, which I think was another big contender, and really wanted to go on this independent literary track. And there was a lot at stake. And I remember when we were eating Timothée, and everybody was slightly sizing each other up, literally as well, because all the French editors were fantastically slim. Each of them were more svelte and more glamorous than the next. And well, speaking for myself anyway, I felt very clunky by comparison. But there was a question in the Toby Alone books. There is a conseil, which is a council of the elders that makes decisions in this tree, in this sort of republic where people are the size of a grain of rice. And Timothée was really kind of leaning in with his elbow to the humor in that, and emphasizing the con, meaning stupid, in conseil. And I think Jane Winterbottom had tried me out earlier and was saying, you know, what are you thinking? And I said, assembly. And it was at that moment that Timothée and I kind of began to riff off each other's humor. We both come from a theatre background. We both love dialogue, and we're both very excited by how you create pace. And I was saying to you, Nikki, that there was this whole children's book review edition dedicated to Timothée recently, and I wrote a short piece for it in French. And one of the things I was writing about alongside the German translator was that actually to recreate Timothée's pace sometimes in the English, I have to alter the punctuation quite a lot, and that the short staccato sentences in French don't always translate in the English, and I have to find other tricks to get the pace across.
I'm sure that is something we're going to come to when we look more closely at the translation as well. But I'd like to just introduce our audience this evening to this wonderful, wonderful fable, a book that I've called a fairy tale, but we can discuss that. And I'd like, Timothée, if we could start by you telling us a little bit about this story and why at this point in time you chose to write a contemporary tale.
Yes, I know I wanted to write, yes, a fairy tale or a Christmas tale, something, and it's very, there is something very special in Christmas tale. There is something which is not in a precise time, which is not, we don't know when it is. And I decided to change something because all my stories are in the past, in the future, or in a tree, or with a little people of 1.5 millimeters, or I don't know, but it's never today. So I chose the fairy tale to write about today, which was, I'm sure it was the first time in my life. And so it's like a provocation, something like that. Sarah, peut-être tu peux m'aider. J'ai choisi justement le récit de l'imaginaire, le récit de la rêverie, du conte.
So I deliberately chose the narrative of the imagination, of a dream state, of the fable.
Pour parler de quelque chose de social, de politique, de contemporain, comme jamais je ne l'avais fait auparavant.
Political and contemporary. Pardon, je t'ai coupé à la fin là.
Non, donc comme jamais je ne l'avais fait auparavant.
In a way that I'd never done before. So choosing that fable mode in order to tackle something direct and political and social and contemporary.
Tell us what it is that you're, I mean, I know because I've read the story, but there may be people listening this evening who've not yet had the chance to read it. Yeah. So what is it that you are tackling that is of this moment?
Pardon, Sarah, peut-être tu peux...
Ça traite de quoi précisément?
Précisément,
comme thématique actuelle.
I don't want to say exactly, because
Okay.
I want to keep a little mystery, because there is something which appears very late in the story, and I want to keep it. But it's about three destinies, three stories. The first one is a man who's driving a little truck he wants to sell ice creams for Christmas, and he's going from Italy to London. And the second story is the story of a bird, a swallow, and a swallow coming from Africa and coming to the north, and we don't know why. She's in the bad sense of she
the wrong direction.
Yes. And the third story is this mystery, is a third destiny, third character who is in big danger, and these two, the swallow and the man, will change his life. That's the story. Yeah. So
your van driver, as Thomas Campy has shown, in this bright yellow van, is called Freddie D'Angelo. So I would suggest that angels come where you least expect them.
Yeah, that's something like that. I'm not sure I was conscient of yes, I'm not sure I knew that when I write. The question is not to what if I want or don't want to put this name of angel in the name, but I put it. So you can see it and you can choose to see it. Can
I ask you, this story is very different to the other stories that we've mentioned. So when I read Toby Alone, I feel that I'm reading a book that's written for children. I feel that is the implied reader of that book. But when I read this short fable, I didn't necessarily think that you were speaking exclusively to children, in the same way that Oscar Wilde, with his fairy stories, is talking to an adult audience as well as a child audience. I wondered whether that was conscious on your part.
Yes, it was conscious. I knew, and it was the first time to. I write one book which was about childhood, but for adults, which the name is Neverland. There's something about Peter Pan too in this book, Neverland, and I wrote it for adults. And it's about children, so I don't want children to read it because they don't have to know what is the mechanic of childhood. They just have to live it, to live and to be a child. So when I wrote this story, A Swallow in Winter, I knew that I was talking to, I didn't know exactly who I was writing for. When I write, I always have like a little reader on my shoulder, some little reader, and I always do this to say, are you here? Are you here with me? Are you still with me? And here I didn't have it. I was alone, and I was yes. So yes, it's exactly what you said. It's not specially for children, and it won't be exactly the same story if it was only for children. But Walker Books or Gallimard Jeunesse are publishing house who can, and literature for young people is a very open house. And I'm sure half of my readers are adults. For Toby Alone, for Van Gogh, for Perle,
The
and
Book of
yeah.
Pearl.
Do you agree, Sarah?
I love that idea of it as the open house.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've offered Van Gogh to grown-ups who were ill in hospital, actually, and who just needed something to completely disappear into that offered them a different kind of adventure, and loved it. And I love this description of literature for young people as a very open house.
It's
and
wonderful,
covering all
actually.
angles.
It is wonderful because, I mean, I'm going to be buying this for Christmas presents for adults and for children. But that idea of an open house means that it can reach a wider readership. If it was published on an adult list, children would never get to see it. It would not happen. So, Timothée, you also write for theatre. Now, does that in any way influence how you write? I mean, very different because it's led by dialogue. But not this story. But has theatre had any impact on how you write this?
Yes, I think theatre. In theatre, words are acting. And you can't speak to speak. You speak to act, to change the things, to change something. So, and I think in my books, I try to do this. I try to, there is a visual part. I think in theater, you have a show and you, it's yes, there's something visual in the way of writing stories for young people. But there is something about language and dialogues too. Dialogues must be necessary. They're not just dialogues as the best way to tell who is speaking, who is talking, and what is the situation.
It's interesting because in theatre, I think when dialogue is redundant, it shows up so obviously when it's not needed in theatre.
Sorry.
Que dans le théâtre, ça se voit tout de suite quand le dialogue, quand on n'en a pas besoin.
Exactly.
Because quand c'est de trop, quand c'est inutile.
Yes, and the stage is totally empty when the dialogues are not necessary. There's nothing. All the bodies are going out. So yes, it's and if the stage is empty, the reader is going. And when you write for young people, you have that's really, I like this. I like knowing that my reader is not here for always. I have to keep it with me.
You can't take them for granted.
Yes.
Not at all. Yeah. I wonder if we could just bring Sarah in for a moment and talk a little bit about the translation, and then we'll have a discussion between the three of us in a little while. I'm just going to share the screen again for a moment. And so everybody can see, I think, if it works. There we are. So everybody can see the two covers, the French and the English here. And we're going to talk a little bit about translation, Sarah, but it's immediately obvious to us that A Swallow in Winter is not the direct translation of the original title. Perhaps the two of you could tell me a little bit about the conversation that went on around the title for this book and what differences you think are conveyed in the French and the English.
And it's very interesting, we were talking about this just before. Perhaps Timothée, you could start us off, because originally you wanted it to have a different title in French.
Yes, my first title was Gloria, which is the name of the
swallow.
Gloria sous la neige. So Gloria under the snow. And I had a problem because my dear friend, François Place, which is a great writer, illustrator, and he has all the talents. And he just wrote a book which was The Queen Under the Snow. And
La Reine sous la neige.
La Reine sous la neige. La Reine sous la neige.
About Queen Elizabeth, the late
Yes,
Queen Elizabeth
about Queen
II.
Elizabeth, yes. And I know that if we had two Gloria sous la neige and La Reine sous la neige, the same months of the same year in the same publishing house, it's not possible. So I decided to, it's like a present for my friend. And I changed, and I wanted to change totally and to choose a very different title. So I chose this title. I don't know how you would have translated it, Sarah.
Well, so this led to very interesting conversations with Walker Books. Walker Books from the start always liked the idea of the title being A Swallow in Winter. And I think in that sense, it's exactly what Timothée was describing, that you have these three elements to this story, and these elements come together. The man, Freddie D'Angelo, driving the van, the swallow, Gloria, flying in the wrong direction, flying north in winter, and then this other character who gets caught up between Gloria and Freddie. And in a sense, we've just shifted to the swallow's angle, and here with the quelqu'un, someone is waiting for me behind the snow, on the other side of the snow, beyond the snow, has perhaps a more human feel to it. So it has a different emphasis on that those three strands. But what it led to, because this phrase anyway is in the book and is repeated in the book, and so we had a lot of thinking about whether it was beyond or on the other side of, and I just discovered the email that Jane, the publishing director, sent to me, and I'll read it to you. And she writes, "A very quick and rather urgent email, as we're about to send this out to reproduction. But on a final read, I decided to change the translation of Quelqu'un m'attend derrière la neige, which Gloria says to herself when she's flying north, from someone's waiting for me on the other side of the snow to someone is waiting for me through the snow." It's still snowing when she gets to the village. So the village that she arrives at is in the north of France, and it's Christmas Eve and it's snowing. So it seemed to make more sense. What do you think? So even up to the wire, this performative language, I think that's what I took from Timothée's description of the need for every word to earn its place and to never bore the reader and to never leave the page or the stage redundant. This sort of performative use of language makes everything so chiseled that we're arguing about prepositions right up to the wire. What for you is the difference, Nikki, in those two titles as an Anglophone reader looking for a title to appeal to you?
Well, A Swallow in Winter is more obvious before I pick the book up. Combine that with the illustration, where obviously the French edition, the focus is very much on the van and therefore the human character in the story. I suppose one, I would have to get so far into the book in order to interpret and think about that title. The other one's sort of giving it to me in a way, but it's only giving me part of it, because as we've said, it's not just about a swallow. And I wondered whether A Christmas Miracle, that subtitle, whether you feel that I don't know whether that was your addition or whether that was a marketing idea.
Yeah, I suspect that's more of a commercial decision.
Okay.
Timothée, do you have a reaction to that?
Perhaps it's commercial, but I like it. I think I like it. The word miracle is, I like it very much, because it says something about what is writing and telling story. We have the possibility of making miracle when you write story, and it's like it's everyday Christmas for us, whether you write novels. So I like it. Yeah.
And I think as well, it speaks to a very important theme in this, which is that Freddie D'Angelo doesn't hold with, if you like, if you want to pun on it, he has no truck with festivities and special days. They mean nothing to him. And for that reason, he plays Frank Sinatra crooning Christmas songs all the way through the year, because he's not limited to listening to them at Christmas. And yet this extraordinary thing happens to him. So I think there's something there that's very poignant.
Sarah, should we have a look in detail at some of the decisions that you make around translation? We've got some slides to have a look at, which I'm sure will be of interest, and I'll be led by you in terms of what you want to talk about here.
Great stuff. So one of the things to flag up is that one of the audience members tonight is Rosie Eyre, and Rosie Eyre is a brilliant emerging translator, and I had the privilege of mentoring her for 6 months, but it's an ongoing relationship through the National Centre for Writing and their emerging translator scheme. And it's to kind of show people, I could have picked any pages. There are no pages that are sort of radically more interesting than others, but it's to show people who are less familiar with the translating process, and even those who are, just when the language is this performative and this chiseled, how we keep niggling and piggling and fettling and whittling and all those kind of craft words at it right up to the wire. And Rosie was fantastic because she read an early draft for me, and she was my critical reader, and she asked lots of questions that I needed answering. So this is the passage in French, and if we go on to the next slide, we can see just a photo shot from a Word doc. And the bit that's particularly interesting here, I'm just trying to bring up the right bit in my French. There we go. Is this business of being born again from the mist. And in the French it says puis la terre naître à nouveau sous la brume. And so this swallow has witnessed the earth rising up again from the mist. And literally the phrase in French means being born again. And you can either have that literally, which is quite fitting in this context, or you can have it in a more commonplace everyday language about rising up again. And so Rosie was challenging me about that in terms of the economy of it. And it was very helpful to have those questions asked, and ditto around this idea of what the swallow is doing in relation to the equator. And the literal translation would be that she had left a few days ago the line of the equator, which should have held her throughout the winter. And if we go on to the next slide, so we've moved on from a Word document, and now we're in an very early proof, if you like, from Walker Books. And here I'm still niggling and piggling at it and still worrying whether it should be defied the pull of the equator or quit the equator. And I'm wondering, I've done born anew instead of resurging, because as I read that out loud, which I do with all my work, even though I liked the economy that Rosie had suggested, I wanted a language that was almost more biblical, more miraculous. So just to give you a sense of the toing and froing that goes into that process. And then there's another spread coming up.
Just before we look at that one, Sarah, when I read your translation of this book, obviously, I have no idea of how closely that matches Timothee's work without having the French in front of me. And even then, I wouldn't be quite so sure. But this, in a way, makes it a good translation, that I don't see the clunkiness behind if you'd given it a literal translation, as you've just described there. To me, it would have screamed at me translation, whereas it doesn't.
That's very kind of you to say. there are times when you would want it to sound clunky if that is deliberately what the author is voicing. So, and translators have a tendency to kind of normalize and to make it sound smooth. So it can sometimes be tempting to smooth it out where actually that's not called for in the original. But I think here, as we've said, the words are very performative, and actually because this isn't dialogue for the most part, and because this isn't the pace that Timothée normally writes at, I'm not dealing with the usual punctuation issues. So at that level, it's very, very faithful. It's holding very much to Timothée's punctuation, but always that, you know, that very kind of troublesome notion of faithfulness. What we're looking for is that performative clarity of his voice and whatever it takes to achieve that. And there's a very out loud quality. There's a very spoken quality to the way that Timothée writes. And so you hear that when you read it out loud. And that was where resurging for me lost out. It was like an auction. They were against each other and it lost out to Born Anew.
Born Anew.
Yeah.
I will move on to the next example.
Thank you. So this time, here we are in the van, and I'm just going to open this at the right page in my book. And so it's Christmas Eve, and this yellow van is crossing, you know, through this cold, cold morning, and it's triple locked. And in the back of it, there are 600 containers of chestnut ice cream or almond milk ice cream, and they've been picked up in Italy and they're being delivered to London. And if we look on to the next page, Nikki, and I've copied a bit of the comment box twice just so you can see. So this deals with really the heart of some of the language of Timothée's writing. And what I ended up with, let me open my English version. So where you can see Freddie felt a growing sense of unease. He would brood, it has on your screen, and I had sitting in his van for hours. He would brood over the great unrest of our times, how everything had gone to rack and ruin, invaded, unrecognizable. Deep down, though, in his heart, despite the world around him being torn apart, he wasn't unhappy to be on the roads, rather than alone in his modest home under the flickering strip light of his kitchen. And a sort of tricky bit to translate there is this malgré ce monde à feu et à sang, which is I eventually translated as despite the world around him being torn apart. I think I had so many up in arms in the version that you can see there. And this phrase à feu et à sang, if you do that to a town, you're putting a town to fire and sword. And if it's a region, my Collins dictionary tells me then it's about a region being torn apart or laid waste by war. And so there was a real kind of calibration here as to how dramatic and how kind of high stakes the language was to be, and at what point that becomes over the top and clashes with this moment of a man driving in a van carrying ice cream containers. So again, those were things that I was niggling and piggling back and forth again with. And Rosie's asking me that brilliant question about grumbling to himself, she's suggesting. And I ended up, sorry, I'm looking across different versions here. On this particular Christmas Eve, down to, he was muttering to himself, I had in the end. And normally we might try and avoid too many reflexives in translation, because you obviously use them all the time in French, and you can trip up and they can really kind of drown out the flow in the English. But actually, Rosie asking that question was fantastic, because it got me thinking about it again and thinking about what I wanted for something very fluent there. Worth noting as well that where it's highlighted and says after he had driven across France, so I've added that. And Timothée, full disclosure, I was kind of mapping your route from Italy, or Freddie D'Angelo's route from Italy to London, and working out the time frames for each of this, and therefore working out how I could refer back to that. And there's a moment where I think it's is it the A26, the autoroute?
Yeah.
And again, I said, okay, but that's also known as the autoroute des Anglais. And so these little kind of cartographical, is that a word anyway, these kind of geographical details, I was plotting slightly more for the reader, and particularly for the young reader who wasn't always familiar, and just slightly sometimes recapping on where we'd just been. So that kind of tiny bit of glossing coming in.
Can I just ask you, it sounds really helpful to have somebody like Rosie, who's your mentee. To what extent, you've also mentioned the dictionary there, to what extent do you need other tools around you? You're so experienced, and you're so experienced, but are other people a good resource apart from Timothée? Are dictionaries, what do you use?
Well, we're always evolving and we're always getting better, and the moment we stop being open to other resources, it's suicide. So it's, for me, a huge amount of it is reading it out loud and trying that on poor, frankly suspecting, not unsuspecting people who I trust. That's part of it, but then depending on the book, there's going to be levels of research. In this case, it's trying to strike the note, as we've discussed, of a fable that works for grown-ups and for children, and is the open house that Timothée is requiring. Of course, Walker Books is fantastic in providing levels of editing, and again asking, as you saw, even from Jane, right up to the end, really on point questions. And I think that's one of the glorious things about translation, is that it's as if the text gets a whole other nourishment session when it's born again in another language, through being edited again. And we all know Timothée, looking back at Van Gogh and Toby Alone and so on, would find something in there that he would want to change, or that he would want to evolve, or that he hadn't nailed in absolutely the most ideal way. We're all moving there. And so if you have another layer of brilliant editors in another language with other cultural questions, it seems to me that that can only be a great richness and a great benefit. And that, Timothée sort of comes out having had his amazing text loved all over again and cared for all over again, and also really important, challenging and critical questions asked of it all over again. And provided that's done with humility and respect and curiosity, and a desire to make that voice sing to its greatest ability in a brand new culture, brand new context, brand new readers, then that seems to me a good premise on which to proceed forth.
So I have a question for both of you, and that is what you would consider to be overstepping the mark, taking it too far. I'm interested in, from both of you, what that would be.
And I think we can take this picture down probably now, because people are going to get tired of my Word documents.
What would be a step too far in terms of, when it becomes no longer the work of the author, the translator has turned it into something else? How do you make that judgment? And what would Timothée be happy with and not happy with?
So that's a big question about appropriation, isn't it? Which is a really fascinating one. Timothée.
Tu peux me traduire, pardon?
Tout à fait. So I'm going to interpret for Timothée.
Non, mais
je risque de te traduire en même temps, Timothée.
Non, mais traduis-moi, Nikki, d'abord. Dis-moi, parce que j'ai pas bien compris la question.
Ah, d'accord. Donc la question, à quel moment est-ce que ça devient hors limite? Est-ce que ça devient trop ce que fait le traducteur ou la traductrice? À quel moment, elle est très intéressée, Nikki, par à quel moment est-ce que ça tourne vers la trahison ou etc. Alors pour toi, où sont les limites? Et qu'est-ce que tu cherches
Pour moi, c'est vraiment une question de confiance
It's primarily a matter of trust.
Et de confiance dans l'être humain qui traduit.
In the human being who is translating.
Et à partir de là, je décide que c'est elle qui sait et que moi, depuis mon continent, et je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas ce que le lecteur anglais va comprendre. Donc, je pense que pour moi, il n'y a pas de limite à partir du moment où le résultat est bien.
So it's a very beautiful and a very characteristically both humble response from Timothée, but also a challenging response in that Timothée is saying that on the basis that there is fundamentally this trust in the translator, then he's fully committed to that. And that translator has to make decisions on his behalf. I'm adding in here, presumably, you know, with the publishing house and the trust with the publishing house, which we have in spades with Walker Books, because Timothée can't know what the English reader will and won't understand. And so the tiny glossing examples you saw there, I might add, would be an example of where Timothée is trusting me to add just enough for the English reader to have that information. So what Timothée is saying is that there are no limits to what a translator can do, provided that trust is fundamentally there. So I'm assuming, provided that trust is never fundamentally abused, on the basis that the results are brilliant. So that's what I mean by him being both humble and setting a challenging response.
Can you, it's exactly like if I give a tree for Sarah's garden and she planted it in her garden. I don't always call her to say, put water. She knows how is the rain in England, how is she knows now it's her tree. And so it's, I must be confident, yes.
So what we're seeing here is a mutual trust that you talked about at the beginning. Of course, not all translation processes have that communication going on. I have known writers here in the UK whose books have been translated and they've never been part of that conversation. It could be a completely different book that hits the shelves in another country. Sarah, for you, what is there a limit?
Yeah, there is a limit. And funnily enough, I think that limit can occur when style wags sense. Because I think as translators, because we're not responsible for character, and because we're not responsible for plot, and because we're not responsible for making any of that up, then we have this big challenge to make the language as limpid or beautiful or jagged or whatever it needs to be as possible. And if we fall in hock to that, then there can sometimes be a danger that in trying to make something stylistically as wonderful as it can be, that and this has happened to me, that then in a bid to make it stylistically beautiful, something drops out in the edit process because we just say, well, we don't need that, do we? It's much more beautiful or whatever without. And actually there's a risk that you've missed a tiny bit of detail that actually does matter in a way that you only realize later. So there's a constant tension, I suppose, between the translator as stylist and the translator as interpreter, as the communicator of sense. And so I think that the voice is what holds all of that, but making sure that everything is always contained in that voice and that you don't over polish and risk losing something in that process.
Wonderful. I'm just going to remind people if they could put questions into the chat, because we're coming to you in just 1 second for any questions. If you put one quite near the top of the chat, perhaps you wouldn't mind putting it in again so we can pick that up easily without having to scroll backwards and forwards. While I'm just waiting for people to enter any questions that they have, Just one more really to both of you, and it's about not the translation of words, but something you and I have talked about in the past, Sarah, which is the translation of culture. I mean, that is something that happens too, isn't it? And are we too, the word's not aggressive that I want, but too concerned that we have to translate culture for children? Isn't part of world literature giving them access to different cultures?
Absolutely, and you're spot on, Nikki. And you know, in the kind of, I'm getting to be an old granny these days. I started translating in 98. I can't even do the math on that, but I think it's around quarter of a century ago. And attitudes have changed so much, and the shift from what in academic circles is called domestication, so sort of trying to make that text feel as if it were born in England, you know, and the shift is really away from that. We live in such a hybrid moment where so many cultures hugger-muggering alongside, and that's the joy of it. And seeing that and not being afraid of that and making space for that is absolutely the direction of travel. Slightly on a tangent, but I went to hear the great Senegalese singer Youssou N'Dour at the Barbican last week, and it was just wild. I could have just, aside from the fact that it was amazing on stage, I could have watched the audience all night. I've never seen such a diverse audience coming together in one place. And that concert had changed as well, because it would try to have pitched itself more at London in the past. This didn't do that. It was absolutely unapologetic and uncompromising, and it was Dakar that had landed slap bang in the middle of the Barbican Centre. And I think that boldness within literature and within all sorts of parallel and myriad and hybrid lives coexisting, I mean, that's the big shift for our times, and that's a really exciting move to behold and make space for others to contribute to.
I mean, I love that, because we don't need to find another ex-writer writing in the same vein. What we need are different viewpoints, different worldviews. And so that's really why I was asking that question, because and it's so encouraging to hear what you're saying about that shift.
And just before coming on here, I was listening to the BBC podcast, This Cultural Life, and I was listening to Penelope Lively, the great children's writer, and she was talking about how much unlearning she had to do as a historian, but as a child who grew up in colonial Cairo. So yeah, this is all part of that unlearning and that shifting of perspective, isn't it?
I'm just coming to a comment. It's not a question, but perhaps we can turn it into a question. Piers Torday says that he's enjoyed conversations with his translators about idioms and humour, which are often the hardest things to translate. Is that true?
I think for Timothy, you tell me what you think, but I think from the get-go, we made each other laugh. And actually, I feel like our trust is based in our humour. And the kind of the jousting, the l'escrime, Timothée. Yeah. Timothée's daughter and my son both did a bit of fencing, as it happens. Actually, I don't know if Jeanne is still fencing Timothée.
Yeah. Yes.
But that kind of jousting with words and that humour, for me, that's the basis of our trust. And as people with theatre backgrounds, actually, idiom is the spoken language, isn't it? So in a way, I think we buck the trend, because I think that's our area of more trust and more confidence.
I know when I've...
Yes, I agree totally.
I do remember when you and I first started talking, Sarah, and you were researching dialogue, listening to the idiom of young people in Brixton, for instance. So I can see how that would be perhaps easier for you than maybe some other translators. I do have another question here, which is from Kelly Marshall, and she just wants to ask you, perhaps Timothée, what were your favourite books when you were a child?
I was a reader of illustrated books, like, for example, when I was born in 73, there was all the books, not all the books, but practically all the books of Tommy Ungerer. Tommy Ungerer, which is really for me a storyteller and an illustrator who made it was like he was painting inside me when I was a child, because it was really I built my personality and my creativity with him. So first it was this big illustrated book like Les Trois Brigands. I don't know the translation.
The Three Robbers here.
Yes. And then novels of adventure novels, Alexandre Dumas, Jules Verne, and very large reading, because when I was in holidays, for example, I was at my grandmother's house, and she had a little library, like to put the books, and I take the books from the first one to the last one, 1 year after 1 year, and
a different shelf each year.
Yes. And I didn't know if it was for me or not for me. I was really, I would like to say, like your friend Pennac, that I was Sarah, that I was a cancre, or I was
a dunce. You'd like to say you were a dunce.
But I wasn't totally that. I was a reader.
Just to say that Tommy Ungerer, The Three Robbers, obviously was winner of the Hans Christian Andersen Award, which is the highest international award given for children's literature. And I know yourself that you've been nominated by France for that award. And indeed, it is a French writer who is the most recent recipient of that award. And I do believe you've worked with her, Sarah. It's Marie-Aude Muraille.
Oui, Marie-Aude Muraille, extraordinaire.
Yeah, Marie-Aude Muraille. Okay, so then what you were saying, Nikki, about me researching slang, that all began when I went to live in Marseille for a while in 2004 on a grant from the French Book Office, because Marie-Aude Muraille has siblings, and they got together to write a 5-book series called Golem, and that's what you and I were discussing, and that was a reimagining of the Jewish golem myth, and that was where I began sort of investigating how you would translate multicultural slang. So I have translated Marie-Aude Muraille, but I've translated her in plurality as opposed to her as a solo writer.
Yeah. One more question here. It's also from Kelly, and I'm going to ask it in a Kelly, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way, because you're asking about birds other than the swallow, but actually we haven't really talked about the swallow itself and why we think that that is such a powerful bird for this story. Timothée, tell us something about that.
I love swallows. When March, April come, I'm at my window with my friends in the south of France. They tell, they are coming. And we can make the map of the coming of all the swallows around the France by phone. We can say they're coming here in Bordeaux, in Nîmes, in Nantes, in Paris, and so I love it. I don't know why. I think it's because they're always flying, they're magic, and I like they're playing. For me, they're like dolphin, a dauphin, like
dolphins.
Yes, dolphins. There's something and I know that Sarah has the same love, and it's really a miracle.
It's very personal to me, so that when I knew I really loved them, actually, I was on honeymoon